Los Angeles under siege. Trump's military deployment triggers a constitutional crisis. On June 10, 2025, an unprecedented event shook the foundations of American democracy. President Donald Trump ordered the deployment of military troops to Los Angeles. A decision that, beyond its immediate significance, reveals deep-seated tensions between the federal government and local authorities in a political climate marked by divisions, authoritarian fears, and racial divides. While California became the epicenter of this crisis, its repercussions extended far beyond the state's borders, and even those of the United States. This military intervention, ordered without the consent of Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom, is part of a strategy of confrontation assumed by the White House. Using the pretext of an insurrection linked to protests against immigration raids, Trump is relying on a controversial legal arsenal to justify sending the National Guard and Marines into the streets of a Californian metropolis. This maneuver raises a series of crucial questions. Is the Constitution in danger? Is the president overstepping his authority? Is America entering a new authoritarian era? To understand what is at stake in this historic crisis, we need to go back to its origins, analyze its protagonists, decipher its legal, social, and geopolitical implications, and anticipate future scenarios. That's the aim of this investigation: to offer the public a complete, documented, and educational reading of a confrontation that could redefine the future of American institutions.
Zero-tolerance immigration crackdown sparks LA unrest. It all begins with the resurgence of a policy familiar to Americans, that of zero tolerance on immigration, reactivated in the first weeks of Donald Trump's return to the White House in January 2025. In declaring his determination to take migration order back into his own hands, the Republican president gave ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, carte blanche to step up field operations. Before long, the federal agency's unmarked vans were back on patrol in entire Los Angeles neighborhoods, including Paramount, Boyle Heights, and Southgate. But what really lit the fuse was a scene filmed on June 7, 2025, outside a Home Depot store in Paramount. Plainclothes ICE agents brutally arrested several Hispanic workers presumed to be undocumented. These viral images, broadcast in a loop on social networks, created indignation. Local associations such as CHIRLA and the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights denounced these methods as worthy of a police state. In the hours that followed, spontaneous rallies broke out in front of ICE detention centers, then in downtown Los Angeles. The federal authorities' response was immediate and heavy-handed. Stun grenades and tear gas were used to disperse the demonstrators. The use of force only served to increase the anger. The demonstrators denounced the hypocrisy of a system that criminalizes workers while profiting from their labor, and point the finger at Trump's strategy, provoking an escalation to justify wider repression. The climate of oppression that is taking hold is reminiscent of the darkest hours of the previous presidency, particularly during 2018's mass deportations and family separations at the border. Added to this is a decisive political factor. Since 2024, California has reinforced its status as a sanctuary state, prohibiting local law enforcement from any collaboration with ICE. This policy, backed by Governor Newsom, makes California a thorn in the side of the federal government and an ideal confrontation ground for Trump. The raids in early June were seen not just as a security operation, but as a federal declaration of war on a disobedient state. This first spark ignited a firestorm. Los Angeles enters a zone of acute tension, where every arrest becomes a provocation, every demonstration a threat, and every presidential declaration a potential escalation.
Trump defies Posse Comitatus Act with unprecedented LA troop deployment.
On the morning of June 8, 2025, Los Angeles residents were stunned to discover the presence of 2,000 National Guard troops in the streets. These troops, deployed on an emergency basis, were patrolling critical infrastructures, police stations, and certain neighborhoods already under stress. The announcement was sudden, unexpected, and above all, made without the approval of California Governor Gavin Newsom. The following day, 2,000 additional reservists joined the force, but this was only the beginning. On June 10, Donald Trump crossed a threshold that no one had dared to cross in over 50 years. 700 Marines were sent to reinforce Los Angeles. It was the first time since the Vietnam War that the regular army had been mobilized for a law enforcement operation on national territory. A strong, spectacular gesture, but also legally questionable. For this decision violates the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, a founding law which specifically prohibits the use of the army for civil actions without the authorization of Congress or the explicit request of a federated state. This law, designed to protect American democracy against military excesses, is now being circumvented by a presidency that claims to want to restore order at all costs. In the face of criticism, Donald Trump is martial. If they spit, we spit back, and I promise you, we will hit back like we've never hit back before. This bellicose tone is echoed in his media interventions, where he accuses Democratic governors of complicity with the rioters and justifies the military presence by a supposed threat of urban secession. In fact, no federal state of emergency has been declared, and Congress has not been consulted. The military intervention was therefore based solely on a unilateral presidential decision, which immediately triggered indignation among jurists, constitutionalists, and several elected Democrats. Some compare this initiative to that of Richard Nixon during the 1970 riots, while others see it as a repetition of the authoritarian drifts seen in populist regimes abroad. But for Donald Trump, this show of force serves a clear political objective: to reverse the balance of power with California, weaken his Democratic opponents, and impose a broader reading of presidential prerogatives in times of crisis. The images of light tanks in the streets of LA, of soldiers posted on police station rooftops, and of armed columns crossing Venice Beach mark a turning point. Domestic militarization is now a visible, assumed, and asserted reality.
Newsom versus Trump showdown. Governor sues as president threatens. The showdown took a dramatic turn when Gavin Newsom, California's Democratic governor, decided to file a lawsuit against President Trump in federal court in San Francisco. The object of the complaint is clear: violation of the U.S. Constitution, in particular the 10th Amendment, which guarantees the sovereignty of the federal states, and of the Posse Comitatus law, which has already been violated. By acting without consultation, Newsom argues, Trump is overstepping his executive functions and attempting to militarize a state without legal basis or congressional mandate. This legal initiative is not just an act of resistance. It is part of a strategy of institutional defense aimed at blocking a dangerous precedent, that of a president who could, in the future, deploy the military against any state opposed to his policies. Newsom, a potential presidential contender in 2028, is thus positioning himself as the defender of states' rights and civil liberties, in the face of an assumed authoritarian drift. But Trump's response was immediate and radical. At a rally in Florida, he accused Newsom of treason and openly threatened him. He should be arrested for obstructing federal order. In a tweet that went viral, he called Los Angeles a city wiped off the map, which he claimed had been saved from civil war by his intervention. The words have far-reaching consequences. Accusing an elected governor of complicity with insurgents is tantamount to an accusation of sedition, a verbal escalation reminiscent of the worst tensions in American political history. Behind the scenes, the Trump administration is even considering the possibility of bringing criminal charges against local elected officials in the name of national security. This is unprecedented in relations between Washington and a federal state since the 19th century. In return, several Democratic governors, notably those of Illinois, Massachusetts, and Michigan, publicly supported Newsom, denouncing an attempt at an authoritarian takeover. This legal conflict is not only being played out in the courtroom, but also in the media arena, where each side is mobilizing its support. Conservative networks such as Fox News refer to a resigned governor in the face of chaos, while CNN and MSNBC speak of a presidential power grab. Public opinion, meanwhile, is deeply divided. 42% of Americans support military intervention, according to a Rasmussen poll, while 53% oppose it, including a majority in California. America is thus witnessing a live duel between two visions of power, one centralist and vertical, embodied by a president ready to use force, the other federalist and legal, supported by a governor who is banking on institutions to contain.
ICE raids and police militarization fuel California tensions. At the heart of the political and judicial storm is a federal agency as feared as it is controversial: ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Created in 2003 under the Bush administration, this structure, in charge of enforcing migration laws, has since become the symbol of repression against undocumented immigrants in the United States. In California, it crystallizes all tensions. The return in force of field operations since January 2025 has been accompanied by a radical transformation of its methods. Plainclothes agents, absence of warrants, arrests in front of schools or workplaces, intimidation of families. But the singularity of the Californian conflict lies in the fact that the state has prohibited its police forces from collaborating with ICE. A law passed in 2024, in the wake of the previous administration's humanist migration policies, prevents municipal departments from providing information on migration status or accompanying federal agents during arrests. It is precisely this refusal to cooperate that has prompted Trump to consider California a rebel territory, justifying, in his view, an exceptional response. Faced with this stalemate, the federal administration militarized its strategy. In Los Angeles, ICE raids were carried out under the protection of armored vehicles, with logistical support from heavily armed federal forces. This vision of an over-equipped police force is not new. Its origins lie in the 1033 program, launched in 1997 under Bill Clinton, which enabled surplus military weaponry to be transferred to local police departments. Challenged under Obama, this program was reactivated by Trump in his first term in 2017, and now applied on a large scale. On the streets of East LA, in Compton or in the suburbs of Riverside, citizens find themselves facing helmeted officers, shields in hand, assault rifles slung over their shoulders, a device normally reserved for armed conflicts. Civil rights groups denounce the logic of war applied to civilian neighborhoods. For Jose Antonio Ramos, a lawyer with the National Immigration Law Center, this is no longer security, it's political deterrence through fear. This militarization of the police is also having a major psychological impact on Latin American communities, which make up over 48% of the population of Los Angeles. Many live in constant fear of being wrongly arrested, even if their papers are in order. Some parents have stopped sending their children to school. Businesses are closing for fear of raids. A diffuse climate of terror, only made worse by the presence of federal soldiers. In the background, the image of an America where the federal state uses armed force to bypass local politics raises a burning question. How far can the executive branch go to impose its vision? In California, many see these raids and militarization as a testing ground for a national policy of intimidation. Insurrection Act looms. Trump signals willingness to escalate military. As tensions continue to escalate in California, a word is resurfacing in the corridors of power in Washington, sowing alarm even in Republican ranks: the Insurrection Act. Enacted in 1807, this more than two-century-old law allows the President of the United States to deploy the army on national territory in the event of rebellion, obstruction of law enforcement, or major civil disturbance. Used sparingly throughout history, barely 30 times, notably during the 1992 Los Angeles riots, or to guarantee school integration in the segregated South, it now represents a legal weapon of formidable power. True to his provocative style, Donald Trump is increasingly open about the possibility of using it. Questioned at a press conference in Dallas, he declared, "If they want insurrection, they'll get it, and I will use every means at my disposal to restore order." While no official decree has yet been signed, his statements are seen as a clear signal the president could activate this device at any time, bypassing the governors and freeing himself from constitutional limits. For many constitutional law experts, this threat is less legal than political. For the Insurrection Act, although still in force, remains vague in its definition of insurrection and therefore offers almost total power of interpretation to the president. In other words, if Trump deems the demonstrations in California to constitute rebellion, he can legitimately order a military occupation without going through Congress or local authorities. An extremely dangerous precedent, according to several law professors interviewed by The Atlantic and Politico. This temptation to use force is reminiscent of the events of June 2020, when Trump, then president, threatened to invoke this same law during the Black Lives Matter protests, triggering an unprecedented frisson within the Pentagon. At the time, his own Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, publicly opposed the move. But in 2025, the context has changed. Trump has surrounded himself with military and legal loyalists, less inclined to challenge his decisions. In California, this hypothesis is sending shockwaves. Governor Newsom, in his federal complaint, is already anticipating the potential activation of the Insurrection Act as a legal stifling strategy. He accuses Trump of seeking to bypass the federal system to establish direct management of recalcitrant states. The cities of San Francisco, Oakland, and Sacramento have announced legal protections in the event of prolonged military occupation. Activation of this law would place the United States in a disguised state of exception, without any state of emergency having been declared. This would create an unprecedented situation. A president justifying military intervention against civilians solely on the basis of his own interpretation of events. A slide towards a form of personal power that many compare to the beginnings of constitutionalized authoritarianism. Democracy in peril. Experts and UN warn of Trump's authoritarian tactics. As Donald Trump waves the threat of the Insurrection Act and steps up his show of force, many experts, jurists, NGOs, and even international institutions are sounding the alarm. The specter of an authoritarian shift is no longer confined to opinion polls. It is now a tangible hypothesis in public debate. For New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, the use of the army against civilians, threats against an elected governor, and the criminalization of dissent are typical markers of a regime drifting toward autocracy. Within the United States itself, several former high-ranking national security officials are expressing their concern. Former General James Mattis, ex-Secretary of Defense under Trump, speaks of a president who manipulates the instruments of force to assert his authority, not to protect the nation. Organizations such as Human Rights Watch and the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, publish alarming reports on the restriction of fundamental freedoms, including the right to protest and freedom of the press. According to an investigation by ProPublica, several journalists covering the events in Los Angeles were intimidated or arrested during dispersals by the National Guard. Internationally, the UN's reaction marked a diplomatic turning point. At a press briefing at its New York headquarters, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights called on the United States to avoid any further militarization and to respect the fundamental rights of the civilian population. Such measured but firm language is rarely used in relation to a Western democracy. The European Union, meanwhile, has called for legal clarification on the basis of federal military interventions, while Canada refers to a concern shared by the entire G7. The link between this domestic crisis and other geopolitical tensions, particularly on the international stage, is also being pointed out. NGOs such as Amnesty International point out that the Trump method is not only applied within US borders. The restriction of humanitarian aid to Gaza, denounced in a joint statement by several UN agencies on June 9th, is interpreted as an extension of this logic of isolation, balance of power, and disregard for international conventions. For many observers, this accumulation of signals is no accident. It is a deliberate strategy of tension in which political polarization, fear, and militarization are used as levers to reassert presidential power in defiance of traditional checks and balances. This scenario, theorized by certain Trumpist advisors such as Stephen Miller and John Eastman, is partly inspired by hybrid warfare manuals, in which the law is used to justify exceptional measures.
American democracy, often held up as a model, thus finds itself under global observation, at a time when its own domestic legitimacy is wavering. And if the institutions still hold, their ability to contain this drift will depend on their resilience and the mobilization of civil society. LA in turmoil. Looting and clashes erupt amid anti-ICE protests. On the streets of Los Angeles, the accumulated tensions finally exploded. From the evening of June 10th, neighborhoods such as Pico Union, Boyle Heights, and Westlake were the scene of massive demonstrations, initially peaceful but quickly erupting into violence. While protesters denounced the brutality of ICE raids and the presence of the army, interventions by federal police fueled the anger, turning the gatherings into veritable urban riots. According to official figures, at least 56 people were arrested between June 10th and 12th. Among them were a number of young demonstrators, as well as figures from associations known for their commitment to migrants' rights. 3 police officers were injured, and dozens of vehicles burned. Several local businesses, notably grocery stores run by Latin American families, were looted or vandalized, a tragic paradox in a movement that was denouncing the precariousness of these very communities. The images filmed by TV channels, fires, broken windows, tear gas, truncheon blows, reminded many of the 1992 uprisings following the Rodney King affair. But this time, the ethnic dimension is coupled with an institutional conflict, and above all, with a militarization assumed by the executive. The cameras captured National Guard patrols in combat gear, supported by armored vehicles, in a city that now resembled a war zone. The demonstrators' indignation runs deep. "We're being treated like criminals for wanting to exist in this country," says Maria Ortega, an undocumented mother of 3 who came to demonstrate in MacArthur Park. Others denounce the strategy of chaos. Trump is letting the situation fester, so he can say that only force can restore order, accuses a member of the No ICE LA Association. The violence, although a minority compared to the number of peaceful demonstrators, nonetheless offers the president a golden pretext to justify his policy of repression. In a televised address, Trump spoke of scenes worthy of a failed state and promised to restore law and order at all costs. This rhetoric, tried and tested during his first term, aims to polarize opinion. On one side, the patriots, on the other, the troublemakers. On social networks, videos of the clashes circulate at lightning speed, but the narrative diverges according to platform. On X, formerly Twitter, pro-Trump accounts denounce an organized insurrection, while on TikTok and Instagram, young people document police violence and arbitrary arrests. Digital space is in turn becoming a battlefield, where the war of narratives and legitimacies is being played out. In this chaos, what was originally a protest against migratory raids is transformed into a symbol of national malaise, combining racial inequality, political authoritarianism, and institutional fracture. Los Angeles is no longer just a city, but the mirror held up to an America in crisis. World, shocked. LA military crackdown tarnishes America's democratic image. Beyond America's borders, the images from Los Angeles have sent shockwaves around the world. Military vehicles in the streets of a Californian city, demonstrators being chased by federal soldiers, scenes of tear gas in a residential neighborhood. All these sequences brutally contradict the traditional image of the United States as a bastion of democracy and individual freedoms.
The tone in newsrooms around the world was serious. The BBC headlined, "The American Dream Under Siege," while Radio-Canada spoke of the state of siege of a sick democracy. In Europe, editorials in Le Monde, El País and Die Zeit spoke of an authoritarian turn, comparable to the excesses observed in countries that Washington had previously criticized for their lack of respect for civil liberties. The contrast is striking. The world's leading power is using its army against its own population without any state of war or external threat. The shock is all the greater given that this crisis comes at a time when the United States is seeking to establish itself as the guarantor of democracy in international conflicts, notably in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Yet this moral stance is being undermined by the use of force against demonstrators on its own soil. Several European diplomats, speaking on condition of anonymity, confide their embarrassment at a situation that weakens the American position in international forums. A symbolic event crystallizes this global malaise. The American veto, on June 6, 2025, of a UN Security Council resolution calling for the delivery of emergency humanitarian aid to Gaza. Officially, the Trump administration justified this refusal on strategic grounds. But this veto, combined with the crackdown in Los Angeles, fuels the thesis of the growing isolation of the United States, now perceived as a unilateral player, indifferent to international norms, whether in terms of human rights or humanitarian cooperation. For international NGOs, the California sequence is the symptom of a democracy weakened from within, where authoritarian temptation replaces institutional dialogue. Amnesty International has issued a statement denouncing the disproportionate use of force, while Reporters Sans Frontières is concerned about the working conditions of journalists in the field, who are sometimes targeted by the forces deployed. On social networks, internet users around the world are expressing their incomprehension. In France, the hashtag Los Angeles occupation is going viral. In Germany, the keywords Trump regime and Verfassungsbruch, constitutional violation, are taking hold. Even within the American diaspora abroad, calls for mobilization are multiplying. Solidarity marches in London, Berlin, Seoul, Buenos Aires. This image reversal could have lasting consequences for American diplomacy. In the age of global networks, international public opinion carries a lot of weight. And when the figure of the world policeman merges with that of the domestic oppressor, the moral balance of US foreign policy is shaken. Supreme Court showdown looms. Newsom's lawsuit challenges Trump's power. As the country splits between supporters of presidential order and defenders of local liberties, the legal battle started by Gavin Newsom is about to reach its climax: the US Supreme Court. The appeal filed by the governor of California is based on a clear constitutional argument. President Trump has violated the principle of federalism, state prerogatives, and the limits set by the Posse Comitatus Act. The case, initially dealt with as an emergency by a federal appeals court, is now being examined by the country's highest judges in a climate of unprecedented national tension. For many constitutionalists, the heart of the debate goes beyond the California case. At issue is whether a president can unilaterally mobilize military forces against a federated entity without its consent, based on an expansive interpretation of the Insurrection Act. This trial could well become a decisive jurisprudence on the balance of power between the states and the federal executive, a confrontation reminiscent of the great cases of the 20th century, such as United States v. Nixon or Bush v. Gore. But the judicial outcome is far from certain. Since returning to power, Trump has consolidated a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, with 6 justices reputedly hostile to federal intervention in local affairs, except when it comes to reinforcing presidential authority. Many experts fear that the court, under the guise of a strict interpretation of the Constitution, will validate Trump's national security arguments, paving the way for an increased presidentialization of federal power. In the briefs filed by Newsom's legal team, led by attorney Vanessa Delgado, we find the assertion that American democracy rests on balance, not domination. The state of California presents itself as the defender of the founding principles of the United States, refusing to let force prevail over law. On the other side of the argument, Trump's lawyers invoke urgency, latent insurrection, and the inaction of local authorities to justify military intervention, an argument that echoes the security doctrines used in other authoritarian contexts abroad. The population is following the trial with feverish attention. Legal vigils are being organized in front of the Supreme Court in Washington. Mobilizations in support of Newsom are taking place in San Francisco, and polls are multiplying. According to a Pew Research survey, 58% of Americans believe that the Supreme Court currently plays a decisive role in the survival of democracy, while 29% consider it already compromised. Whatever the verdict, this case redefines the place of American institutions in the crisis. If the Supreme Court validates Trump's approach, it would give legal cover to the domestic use of armed force, which would represent a historic turning point. If it rejects him, it would reaffirm the safeguards of the federal system, at the risk of triggering a political counterattack by the president. Either way, the decision will be a landmark one.
Trump versus California. Historic power clash reshapes US democracy. What began as a muscular response to a wave of migrant protests in Los Angeles has gradually turned into a structural conflict between the presidency and a major federal state. Through this crisis, the entire institutional architecture of the United States is shaking. The federal pact forged over 2 centuries finds itself challenged by a radically centralizing vision of power. The confrontation between Donald Trump and California is not simply an ideological or partisan opposition. It crystallizes fundamental societal choices. On the one hand, a secure, vertical America, re-centralized around a strong executive, ready to suspend certain freedoms in the name of order. On the other, a pluralist, federalist America, attached to the diversity of political models and the rule of law. This opposition goes beyond traditional divisions to become the stage for an existential confrontation over the very definition of American democracy. By bypassing institutional safeguards, Trump has opened a breach. His ability to mobilize federal force without the consent of local authorities, to threaten an elected governor, to use fear to impose his vision, marks an unprecedented break with the American liberal tradition. For his supporters, he represents a strong leader in a dangerous world. For his opponents, he threatens the fragile balance between freedom and authority on which the American Republic is founded. California, in resisting, proposes another model. By taking on a judicial, media, and political showdown, the country's most populous state has become a laboratory for counterpower. Its action could inspire other states resistant to authoritarian centralization, such as Illinois, Washington, and New Jersey, sketching out a variable geometry federation in which confrontation with the federal government becomes an accepted strategy. But this resistance is not without cost. The social climate has hardened, racial divides have widened, and confidence in institutions has eroded. The militarization of public space, traffic restrictions, and mass arrests have left a lasting mark on people's minds. Post-crisis America will never be quite the same. This conflict between California and the Trump presidency, by its scale, symbolic charge, and legal implications, could well become a major turning point in the history of the United States. A kind of new cold civil war, bloodless but profoundly ideological, between 2 irreconcilable visions of power. And in this struggle of models, the rest of the world is watching, fascinated or worried, to see what America will decide to be tomorrow.